Hey pushers, so we are going to be having a video lecture and this is lecture 4.4 on the making of America, the market revolution. And this shows up in several places in the key concept outline. It's kind of spread out over a few different topics, looking at not only how this is going to impact political parties and how they're going to react to this industrialization, but also the industrialization itself with transportation as well as technology, as well as how this is going to impact economics and trade patterns. So we're starting off with the origins of American industrialism, and we're going to look at the conditions that spur American industrialization, the things that actually make American industrialization begin. First of these is our increasing in population, and this is largely due to immigrant migration into the country, specifically being the Irish and then later on the Chinese as well, being used as cheap labor. America also has an abundance of raw materials. We have coal, we have timber, we have oil. We are going to have a lot of these raw materials that are going to make industrialization much easier than it would be in other nations. Also, because Europe is having so many wars and they have all of these blockades, they do need finished goods because they are unable to produce them themselves. But also, because of these blockades, we are in a way forced to do this on our own and to make these materials, because otherwise it would not be created. However, we are going to have difficulty competing with the British in manufacturing, and this is because British industrialization began in about the mid 1700s. We're not getting started until the 1800s, and so we're at least 50 years behind. So it is going to be a struggle for us. So what actually is the market revolution? The market revolution was the expansion of markets, industry, and trade in the first half of the 1800s. And what we're going to be kind of exploring is what are the elements that went into this market revolution, the expansion of those markets, the expansion of that industry and trade, as well as we're going to be looking at the reaction to that revolution. So one of the things that is absolutely essential for the creation of this market revolution is mass production, which is the production of large amounts of products that are standardized, meaning they're all exactly the same, and they're made efficiently and relatively cheaply, especially more cheaply than if they were made individually. This is done through the process of using interchangeable parts, machine tools, and a division of labor. By using these three things, interchangeable parts, which allows for the replacement of a machine, machine tools, which allows for the production of an item quickly, as well as the division of labor, which creates specialization in a particular field, makes for the market revolution to be possible. So we're going to start here with how this market revolution actually begins. And it begins with a man by the name of Samuel Slater, who is known as the father of the factory system. He actually came from Great Britain, and Britain had a monopoly on industrialization. And they ensured that this monopoly remained by passing laws that made it illegal to take any materials, any machines, or any blueprints for machines out of the country. When Samuel Slater moved to the United States, he wanted to ensure that he was able to bring these machines with him. And so he memorized the blueprints for a spinning machine, came to America, and then built it by hand. And that very first spinning machine revolutionized American industry. We were now able to begin catching up with Great Britain. And it became so quickly popular, this spinning machine that turned wool or cotton into thread, that it created a shortage of fiber. Now, initially, wool was the predominant. However, you can only shear a sheep once a year. But cotton, you can plant more and more and more of it and have greater and greater and greater supply. Eli Whitney is also going to be a major part of the beginning of this factory system. Now, a lot of you guys are probably familiar with Eli Whitney's creation of the cotton gin. This machine allowed for the production of cotton much easier. What you have when you have raw cotton, it's very sticky, and it's got all these teeny tiny little seeds in it. So kind of imagine a thing of cotton candy, but with tiny little poppy seeds in it that you have to pick out. It's a long process, it's a sticky process, and it's not very efficient. And because of that, it made cotton really expensive. Eli Whitney created this machine where you could actually put the cotton in the machine and crank this little wheel, and it would card through the cotton. It would comb through it and pull all those seeds out. And that made this much more efficient, much faster, and thus the cost for cotton went down dramatically. And because of the demand for cotton by this new spinning machine, it was a perfect little match made in heaven, and it created a greater demand for more and more cotton, which as a result led to a greater demand for more and more slaves in the South. Now, unfortunately for Eli Whitney, he did not get a patent for this machine. So because of that, he was in need of a job, and he got hired by the U.S. Army to build guns. But what he found was that each gun being made individually by hand led to them being kind of useless. If one piece of the gun fell apart or it broke, you had to basically get a whole new gun. So this is where he came up with the idea of interchangeable parts. Machine-made parts that could be replaced if they broke. And he did this with one of the U.S. Army's rifles. And this idea then expanded to factories where they could now use these machine-made parts to help manufacture finished goods. Other major inventions and innovations that come at this time are going to improve production, trade, and also communication. So a good example of this would be the steam engine. Although this was not invented in the United States, the steam engine would have a massive impact on all industry because it allowed for a lot more power than any type of energy that had come before it. And so this was a clean source of power. It was very, very powerful, produced a lot of energy, and this is what was going to power most of those early factories. This also then was transformed by putting it on a boat. And the steamboat took this same kind of philosophy, the same system, and put it on a boat. Now, why this was so important is because now this allowed us to travel both ways on a river, regardless of the tide and regardless of the current. And so we could maneuver up and down the Mississippi River specifically much more easily and much more quickly than we ever had before. And so this is going to speed up trade, which allows for the price of goods to drop dramatically. And finally, we have the telegraph, invented by Samuel Morse. He developed a code that would allow for the transportation of messages very quickly. So kind of imagine it like, 1800s text messaging. You had to spell it out letter by letter, but it allowed for messages to be moved across the nation extremely quickly. Most of these telegraphs, however, would be built in the North, since that's where most businesses, that's where most factories were. And so there wasn't as many down in the South. The very first transatlantic cable that would link the United States to Europe was going to be connected in 1858. And this would be really important to kind of bringing America into the world economy. And finally, when it comes to inventions, we got to look at the farm. And some of the major inventions that were on the farm is Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper. So for all you city slickers out there, what this does is it allows for the easy harvesting of crops, specifically things like wheat and corn, those kind of stocky type of of crops. And so as opposed to having to take a scythe and swing this thing back and forth and back and forth, this thing would not only cut, but also help collect all of the wheat or corn or whatever it is you were cutting down. And so this sped that process up, which made for less labor, which reduced costs. And then kind of at the forefront of the planting process is the steel plow. John Deere created this steel plow, and prior to this, most plows were made out of wood, and that was not really strong for breaking through the soil. You got these kind of very shallow alleyways that you were planting your crops in, and it just wasn't really very profitable. You didn't really get a huge yield from the seed that you had planted. So with a steel plow, because steel was so much more strong, it could actually cut through the soil easier and deeper and allow for the seeds to have a better chance at actually taking. In the South, cotton was still king, and it was king largely due to Eli Whitney's cotton gin. The cotton industry was immense. It was what created plantation fortunes. It is what drove the economy. It is what drove politics. And cotton was the number one export for the southern states from about the early 1800s onward. And they kind of maintained this agricultural lifestyle, and they didn't really have a need for industry because cotton was so prevalent, it was so profitable. However, because they are agricultural and they're so spread out, they're also very individualistic, and they generally have a distrust towards authority. So starting in the early 1800s, the government was trying to figure out how it was going to react to this new economy that was starting to grow. We hadn't really had a major economic revival or an economic kind of restructuring since Alexander Hamilton's first financial plan. And this very first one for the market revolution is called the American system. It was introduced by Henry Clay, who was at that time the Speaker of the House, and it had three main elements. The first of these was to charter a second Bank of the United States. This was hopefully going to ensure that there was a strong economic and banking system for America's growing industry. That there was going to be a protective tariff to boost American industry so that Americans would be less inclined to buy British manufactured goods and rather buy American manufactured goods. And finally, to build transportation infrastructure in order to transport those goods from the factories to the ports where they could then be sold overseas. This was something that was extremely visible as a result of the War of 1812. Part of the reason why we lost so much of that war was because we didn't have the transportation to move troops or to move supplies. And so to have this, what we call internal improvement, would have been very helpful. And so we knew that it would be very essential to our improvement economically in this industrial age. The West would then, as a result of this, be connected to the East. But the South wasn't really that jazzed about it because most of them used rivers for their transportation to market. And so the debate over the American system would generally be divided regionally and politically, North versus South, and Democrat versus Whig. So the North and the Whigs were generally in favor of the American system. They supported it because it would be good for infrastructure and for industry, which there was mostly that being supported in the North. That's kind of what they were known for economically. They would provide for banking security for trade. Again, that's something that the North is known for. And it would create new transportation methods for manufactured goods. Again, something that the North was already known for. The South and Democrats were largely against the plan. Reason being is that they felt that the tariff only benefited the North. And the reason for that is that people in the South most of them had to import their goods from elsewhere since there wasn't a lot of manufacturing in the South. So while this was going to be good for northern factories because people were buying American goods and rather than British goods, it didn't really help the Southerners any. They also didn't want to pay taxes for roads and canals that were being built in other states. Why should my taxes go to a road that's being built in New York? And they were going to use the 10th Amendment and the understanding of states' rights as their main argument as to why they should not be required to pay for this. As we know, this would later on lead to some major problems for Andrew Jackson, including the issue with the Tariff of Abominations and the nullification crisis. It would lead to the bank war that he has against Henry Clay and Nicholas Biddle. So this is something that will continue on to be an issue for several decades to come. So we're going to look at next what it's like to be part of the working class in America and what it was like for the American laborer. At this point, we are going to have a transportation revolution. The ability to get from point A to point B is going to be significantly easier than ever before. Now, please do not think that it is easy in the sense that it's really easy for us to get in our cars and drive, to Los Angeles. There was still a level of struggle involved, but it was going to be significantly better than it had been previously. So the first thing that we're going to look at are roadways. The first major national road that is going to be built is called the Cumberland Road, which is why it was known many times as the National Road. Another good example of these federally funded roadways is the Lancaster Turnpike. This was going to help with the economic growth of the western states because it was going to link those kind of frontier areas to the major cities that were closer to the East Coast. The Lancaster Turnpike was actually, the Cumberland Road was actually, as you see in the background there, just kind of a graveled road. A whole lot better than what had been before, which was, for the most part, just a kind of rutted path that had been created over decades of people traveling the same road over and over again. This was actually going to be leveled, it was going to have gravel, and it was going to be significantly easier to travel on. The Lancaster Turnpike, on the other hand, was an actually hard-surfaced highway that was paved over with tar. This was also going to be important because with the ease of land travel, it did make the transportation of goods take less time, and thus it made the goods that were being transported significantly cheaper. The next method that we see is water travel. Now, the very first steamboat is going to be built by Robert Fulton in 1807. And because of that steamboat, rivers were now two-way streets. And this really benefited the South and the West, who had a lot of rivers to utilize. The Erie Canal would be built largely by Irish immigrants that came to America. And this was built by New York Governor DeWitt Clinton, and people called this Clinton's Big Ditch, and they thought it was going to be a massive failure. But what the Erie Canal did is it linked the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, to Lake Erie. And this was going to now drop shipping costs dramatically. Shipping costs from the west to the east dropped 20 times. So what used to cost you $100 now only costs you $5. So this was a dramatic reduction in shipping costs. This is going to steal a lot of trade from the Mississippi River, which does hurt the South and the West. However, it does allow for new western cities like Cleveland and Detroit and Chicago to now blossom and bloom because now they have this waterway access to the Atlantic Ocean and to those eastern ports. To build the Erie Canal was extremely difficult. A 3-man team with mules, it took them an entire year to build 1 single mile of this man-made river. It was extremely dangerous due to the the use of dynamite to open up areas and to kind of clear pathways. People died because of that. They died of swamp fever at what became known as Montezuma Marsh. It was extremely dangerous and extremely difficult. And that's part of the reason why it was built by immigrants, was because it was something that was not a job that most people would want. The last thing that we have is the railroad. The Iron Horse, as it was called, was first introduced in the very early 1800s, and it was pretty much a complete disaster. It had difficulty stopping. It had a difficult time with getting started. Many times it would actually explode because of the too much buildup of steam. And so the Iron Horse was kind of a disaster at first. However, by 1860, there are over 30,000 miles of track that have been laid across the United States, 3/4 of which were located in the North, considering that's where most finished goods were being created and had to get to markets. The thing that really kind of made these new railroads kind of viable as a method of transportation for goods was new inventions that were looking at safety, specifically things like Westinghouse air brakes. These air brakes that would ensure that the train actually stopped where it was supposed to stop. And because of its immense power and its ability to pull large amounts of goods and very, very heavy goods, it quickly became the fastest and most preferred method of transportation for both goods and people. Unfortunately, while we do try to connect the country, it also actually leads to a disconnection in the country. Most of these roads, canals, and railroads are going to be linking the West and the North together. They are not really going to have a lot of North-South. And so the South is largely left to use its rivers. And that's largely because they didn't support the American system and they didn't want their money being used elsewhere. So because of this, we have kind of this sectional division of labor that emerges. The North is going to be known for its manufacturing, its banking, and its shipping. The South is going to be known mainly for cotton, and the West is known for its grain and its livestock. This is going to, however, although they are very sectional and very kind of separate from each other, they do very much rely on each other. The North relies on the Southern cotton to make their finished textiles, that the grain and livestock from the West is going to feed both the South and the North. And so it does kind of promote this national commercial tie that they do rely upon each other. Southern business leaders, though, kind of continue to rely on their kind of traditional staples, which creates this very distinctive regional identity that they do not share with the North and the West. And so that is going to be kind of a very early identifier of a cultural division that will one day lead to our actual political division in the Civil War. The working conditions at this time were pretty intense. Workers were sometimes referred to as wage slaves because they were exploited by those that were running the machines or running the factories. You worked for very, very little money, very, very, very long hours. The conditions were pretty harsh. They were unsafe and they were unhealthy. You had smoke and you had coal dust. You had cotton fibers if you were working in a textile factory that you were breathing in. The hours were very long. We're looking at like 12, 14, even 16-hour days. Wages were extremely low. Child labor was common. And it was illegal to have a union because it was seen as a criminal conspiracy. And so people that worked in these factories, while you might think, man, like that's a terrible choice. Why would anybody do this? It's because it was actually more consistent and thus actually better work than being on a farm. If you're on a farm, you cannot guarantee that you're going to have a good harvest. But working in a factory, you know exactly how much you're going to get paid each day. And so it is a little bit more reliable. One thing that is going to be very unique is that this is going to be the beginning of women working outside the home. Prior to industrialization, women did work, but they worked on farms where their families lived, and they produced textiles and clothing at home, and they did things for the home. While they might have had a small cottage industry, maybe making and selling lace or quilts or something like this, it was never on a large scale by any stretch of the imagination. But during the Industrial Revolution, women were now actually being replaced by machines who were able to create far more output than the women could themselves. However, the women were needed to run and maintain the machines, and this provided women greater economic independence than they had ever had before. These women, for the very first time in history, were earning their own wages. Now, most women at this time were still living with their fathers or with their husbands, and so their wages immediately were turned over to them as the male head of household. However, there were a growing number of women who did actually live on their own and had their own income and got to choose what to do with it. And a great example of this were the women that worked in the Lowell Mills. This was in Massachusetts, and this was kind of like the iconic textile factory of the era. And they were known for employing young women. Most of the women that worked there were farm girls who had moved to the cities for better job opportunities and ways to provide more money for their families. The way that the Lowell Mills worked was very systematic. It was very structured, very regimented, almost kind of militaristic. Every single aspect of the girls' lives was regimented to ensure efficiency. What they wore, where they all lived together in these dorms. You had a bell to wake up, a bell to go breakfast, a bell to be ready for work, a bell for lunch, a bell for dinner, a bell for the end of the workday, a bell to go to church, a bell to go to sleep. There were bells for everything. And you also had very strict curfews of when you were allowed to be out out kind of doing your own thing. However, you were not allowed to be in the company of men without an escort or without a chaperone, because they wanted to ensure that the Lowell Mill girls had kind of the highest reputations. They would ensure that you went to church. You had to go to church so that you were, reflecting good moral values. But although this seems kind of like really harsh and like not the place that most of us would want to work at, it was actually highly desirable. Young women felt safe working there and living in these dorms because they were always being watched over by these older female matrons, and also by these the male managers that were at the factory themselves. Parents felt okay with their children going and their daughters going to work at the Lowell Mills. And so once Lowell started doing this system and it was so efficient and so successful, pretty much every other factory started to do the same thing. Now, if that was not something that was up your alley, the other major opportunities for women was nursing. This was a growing occupation for women and would kind of continue to do so, especially once the Civil War begins. Domestic service, meaning that you would be a maid or you would be a nurse, you would be raising somebody's children. Or teaching was suddenly becoming a female occupation. And the part of the reason why teaching turned to a female occupation was because, one, they realized that women were naturally very nurturing, much more than the male teachers were. But number two, especially as the Civil War begins, men are needed to go and fight, and men are needed for more physical and masculine jobs. And teaching was something that could be done by somebody without a lot of physical strength. And thus, teaching became a feminized job. However, with any of these jobs, once you got married, you were expected that you would no longer work, that you would quit work and you would stay home to be with your husband and your children. And so some women did make the decision to avoid marriage, and they were known as spinsters. And many women, even by the age of 24 or 25, if you were not married, you were considered a spinster. And so you would probably remain in the workforce. So next class, what we're going to be looking at is manifest destiny and how this is going to play into our issues of political divide, of industrial divide, as well as how it's going to lead us one step closer to the American Civil War. So I'll see you guys on Friday.